couple of things are pretty well known. One is that there are gender gaps in labor market outcomes. Second is that these gender gaps get much larger later on over the life cycle.
A lot of us wonder about as to why two people with the same degree, with the same qualifications and same skill set, one of which will end up in the boardroom and one ends up stalled in their career or at a dead end.
And what is surprising is even when you look at outcomes of these individuals straight out after graduation, there's a gender gap of about 5 to 6% already when they start out, right?
We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Basit Zafar here with us. He is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan, and more importantly for us, he's a board member at CERP. But for me, what makes his work so exciting and also extremely important is that you actually dive quite deeply into factors that a lot of us wonder about as to why two people with the same degree, with the same qualifications and same skill set, one of which will end up in the boardroom and one ends up stalled in their career or at a dead end. A lot of us wonder about it, but that's all we do. But your work actually goes deep into just how deeply these inequalities are baked into the job application before we even send it out. And so to that end, we're here to talk about the intersectionality of labor markets with human capital, which, in Pakistan is chronically underinvested in. So it's kind of terrifying that before we even get there, the field is so uneven. So Basit, I'd like to start with just getting a sense of what is it about the mismatch in the opportunities that we have and the talent that we actually have and the qualifications that we have? What is something that's really surprised you in your research?
First of all, thanks for having me here. I've never really done something like this, so I'm excited about how this is going to pan out. It's an adventure, but I'm actually excited about it to talk about my work. I think the question that you asked was what struck me about the kind of work that I'm doing, and the work that you're referring to is a strand of my research which looks at gender gaps amongst the highly educated in the U.S. Before I jump in, I think a couple of facts which people who work in the economics of gender they know, but maybe come as a surprise to people who don't know these facts. Even in the most supposedly gender equal societies in the world, gender gaps are very large. They are striking. So when we think about the most gender equal societies, they're typically Scandinavian countries, right? Like places like Denmark. And there people have shown something which is called the motherhood penalty, which is the childhood penalty, which is once women have children, their earnings drop by about 20% right away. And what is surprising is you might think, okay, there's a penalty because you drop out of the labor force for 1 or 2 years. But even 10 years out, not the 20% effect has diminished a little bit, but there's still a sizable impact, a negative 5 or 6%, even in those countries, right? So, and for men, nothing, right? So, and this is something that people have then replicated in all other countries, in many other countries in the world. So this is a couple of things are pretty well known. One is that there are gender gaps in labor market outcomes. Second is that these gender gaps get much larger later on over the life cycle. Once individuals start having families, because of this childhood penalty and so on. And then you can also think of because if there is this childhood penalty or if there are these norms where women are expected to stay at home and take care of the child, then the employers are going to take this into account, right? And then they're going to be less likely to promote women or put them in positions where they would have these chances, right? So my work focuses at a stage that comes prior to this, which is even before women have children. Like think about women once they graduate from college in their early 20s, for example. At that point, at least, these family constraints are not binding, right? They haven't formed families. You would think that these gaps shouldn't exist, right? Like because two individuals, they have the same. So take someone from Harvard Business School, right? Like they both enrolled there. They presumably are very driven. That's why they enrolled there, right? So. And what is surprising is even when you look at outcomes of these individuals straight out after graduation, there's a gender gap of about 5 to 6% already when they start out, right? So my work focuses a lot on trying to understand why is it that there are differences in outcomes earlier on, right after graduation, when we're thinking about individuals in their early 20s. So that part of my work focuses on that piece, and part of this could be because of factors that are driven by the individual themselves, right? Which is not a problem in itself, right? But then part of it could be environmental factors, right? Which are other constraints that are imposed upon to individuals. So part of my work focuses on that, and then part of my work focuses even on the stage prior to that, because if you think about it, let's say if you an individual is deciding to make certain human capital investment decision, right? And especially let's think about a society where these gender norms are very ingrained, right? And think about a female who's 18 or 19 years old. Now she's thinking, okay, I'm going to go. She knows she wants to go to college, right? I'm going to go to college. I want to figure out what I want to do as a career. I know down the road, because of these constraints and social norms, I will have these constraints on me. Now, individuals might then take those into account and already internalize those, right? So they might think, okay, if there's a career which requires traveling a lot, right, for example, or being very competitive or being away from home because of these constraints imposed on me, not because I don't like those jobs. I would actually flourish in those jobs.
Right.
But because of these constraints imposed on me, maybe because I don't want to do that, and maybe I'm going to adjust my human capital investments decisions today accordingly. So a lot of my work actually then also looks at, so there's the other fact, which is maybe not surprising because you see that in every society pretty much, is when you look at, a couple of things. One is maybe it's not surprising. Pretty much definitely in every developed economy, but also in most developing economies, more females graduate from college than men do. Right, so this has been true in the U.S. and developed economies since the early 90s. I assume in Pakistan it's probably also true that more girls graduate from college than boys do. But when you look at what they're majoring in, the majors are very, very different. Right, so in the sense that men are much more likely to go into fields which we call STEM fields,
right?
Science, technology, engineering, and math fields, or into econ and business. Females are much more likely to go into the humanities. So now that's not a problem per se, right? If individuals are making fully informed decisions, that's what they want to study, that's fine. Now, why does this matter? One is because these fields that I just mentioned, STEM fields also happen to be the fields which tend to be the most highly paid fields, right? So econ, business, the STEM fields. Humanities are the fields which education, like a lot of females, for example, go into education. These tend to be lower paying fields, right? So again, that's not but if individuals are knowingly making these choices, that's totally fine, right?
Yeah, but under imperfect information.
But then there's also this other question, like if you see an individual or female going into education, now is she going into education because she really likes education, or is it because the lifestyle that she'll be able to
is that the only choice
is that the only feasible choice that she has, right? So then a lot of my work then tries to understand to what extent individuals are taking into account these other non-wage factors into account when they're making these decisions. So that's the kinds of questions that I work on.
So it's so interesting because it's funny because if women are operating under imperfect information, right? Men are also operating under but exactly. The way that they sort of handle that it's funny because somehow men still end up benefiting.
No, so there's two questions, right? One is one is this issue of imperfect information,
right?
And then that gets on top of that, there are these other constraints that we have, right? So think about what we call social norms, right? For example, there's one norm that is very common pretty much in every country, which is the male breadwinner norm, right? So it's the male who's expected to be the breadwinner, right? So then if that's the norm that already exists, for example, or the norm that this is another norm which is so it's actually interesting in some of these in Germany, for example, female labor supply is very low, especially in Western Germany.
Really?
Eastern Germany has very high because of communism. The labor force participation rates were very, very high, and even now there's a gap between the two. It hasn't really closed even now, right? So, but the labor force, and part of it is also because there's this norm there that when the child is very, very young, you stay at home, right? So if you are in a society where the norm is that okay, it's the mother who should take care of a child, right? When the child is very, very young. And then if these women end up internalizing those norms, it's going to have an impact, right, on the choice. So it's not only about imperfect information; it's about how these other constraints that come on, and then on top of that, we've been talking about societal norms. Then there's this other factor, like there are these some jobs, for example, think about in the finance sector, right? Very competitive jobs, right? So we typically as a society, men and women are expected to behave in a certain way, right? So what we typically observe in the data is that women tend to be much more risk averse, for example, and women tend to be also less competitive, right? Relative to men. I'm all talking about relative to men. Now you might question that, okay, sure. So if you're less competitive, for example, then you will sort into jobs which are not expected to be very competitive, right? So now if you think about finance jobs, right, like, or think about most workplaces, there is a tournament kind of structure, right?
Absolutely.
Like it's not explicit, but like, implicitly you're competing against other people. The best person in that round is then going to be up for a promotion, or many times, like, you have to put yourself up for a promotion opportunity. There's this element of, like, you're putting yourself in for a competition, right? So we know from a broad body of literature that there are gender differences in competitiveness and risk aversion. Now the question then comes is, like, is this something which is hardwired, or is this something that's because of societal reasons women have internalized, right? So because if society expects women not to behave in a way that is competitive, then they will not be then they will not enter competitions, right? So in fact, a colleague of mine is now doing work where she's asking Christine, actually, she's doing this pretty very fascinating work with neuroneedly, where they're asking individuals about their perceptions about how do they view a man and a woman who has a certain trait, right? And what is very interesting is, like, society tends to think of it tends to be very approving of a man who's competitive, right? But on the other hand, for women who are competitive, society doesn't approve of it. But what is interesting is women, they also don't approve of a woman who's who's non-competitive. So women can't have it either way.
We can't win.
You can't win. Exactly. That's the title of the paper, something like that. That my colleague, and she shows that in different domains, right? So, and you might say, like, okay, for men, because you can flip this around, right? You can say, okay, for men, there is no other way but to be competitive, right? And maybe for women, they can be on the margin, but they can't win either way, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the problem that complicates things even more. That when we write down our models, we say, okay, women are less competitive, for example. That's why they're less likely to go into more competitive jobs. But it's not that that's what they wanted to do. It's because there were these other norms that were imposed on them.
You kind of cornered them and then expect them
and then they behaved that way, but not because they wanted to behave that way, but because they were expected to behave that way.
Yeah, it's kind of like, is it destiny, or is it something that, are we just like, is this what we're beholden to for the rest of our lives?
Some of these norms change, right? So there have been these interesting works where they've shown, like, there's this paper from Saudi Arabia where they show that, many times when we indulge in certain behaviors, we are indulging in them because we want to do that course of action, or because we think other people will approve of it, right? What they show that in Saudi Arabia, because norms are changing pretty rapidly, individuals tend to underestimate the extent to which other men around them would approve of women working outside the home.
Right.
So they show that, okay, once we give this information, like, let's say I'm in the study, if they tell me, like, they show that people in their study actually underestimate the extent of the support that men give to women working outside the home. And once they give this information to men, they're more willing to enroll their wives in these labor search platforms and so on. So my point is, like, some of these things change, but generally, like, the pace of change is very slow, right? Like, you can see from your own observational evidence, right? So I wouldn't say it's a hopeless cause. That there is ample evidence that, like, norms shift. They take time, and then related to the point that we were talking about earlier is, like, information frictions, right? So we also live in a world where information now is more readily available, but that comes it goes two ways, right? When information is more readily available, there's just too much information out there, and then how do you navigate your way, and figuring out right piece of information is a whole different challenge. But I do think there are ways to deal with information frictions. Social norms, those things are very slow moving. I mentioned earlier the example of what's happening in West Germany and East Germany. These are norms that have been around for decades, right?
It's really fascinating because we're always considering, when we're thinking about the liberalization of women and like rather the liberation of women and getting them into the same rooms as that men have occupied for many years, but centuries really. But it's you always think that the US or the West might have it more together in it, but it's actually probably more dangerous over there because it's so insidious. In our part of the world, it's actually like there for everybody to see. It's very demonstrable in all aspects, right? And in the US, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it does feel like obviously there's been a huge crackdown on like
Right.
women's rights, especially when it comes to women's health.
Right.
We've seen a lot of like, terrible changes in the way that like women are able to access reproductive health care and everything. So sometimes it's hard to believe that the world is moving in the right direction.
I think it's hard to disagree with what you said. Like, I was trying to think as you were like, I'm trying to think of everything that has happened in the US over the last year or so, and definitely the move is in the opposite, at least at the national level, is in the opposite direction. That doesn't mean that there isn't pushback in ways that we might not see directly, right? So I think what you're referring to, for example, the shutdown of DEI, right? So there was this list that was circulated of banned words for NSF and NIH, and it included words like discrimination. Women was, I think, a word in there.
No.
I'm not joking. Like it's so blatant, right? Like but I think in some ways, I feel that's a temporary that's a temporary blip. I do hope, I do believe in that. But because what you do see in these developed economies, and I'm most familiar with the US context, is over the last several decades, women have made a lot of progress. What has happened is the gender gap has sort of plateaued over the last couple of decades. The progress has stalled, right? So, and then the question is, why isn't this gap closing? And a lot of work in academic and policy circles has been trying to understand what is the reason for this residual gap. And there, a lot of my work focuses on like what I was referring to, like, what we call behavioral factors, like, gender differences in risk. But like, many times there are these institutional factors which people didn't put in place for a reason. They just happen to be that way, but they did not factor all these, what would be the implications of that. So for example, I'll give you one example from my own work, and I assume it's the same thing in most here also, is when students are in college, when they're graduating, typically they start looking for jobs in the last year, right? So in the US, a bachelor's degree is a 4-year degree. The last year is the senior year. So I'm simplifying things, but so students typically some students already have a job lined up by the beginning of their senior year. They intern somewhere, they made a full-time offer, the student accepted it, right? So sure. So, and then during the course of the senior year, they're looking for jobs, right? So, because everyone wants a job in hand by the time they graduate, right? Not everyone will have a job, but usually in a normal labor market, most students will have a job within 6 months of graduating, right? And what we saw in the data was that because we collected data on when students were accepting job offers, and what we saw is women were accepting and this is looking at business undergraduate majors from one university. What we saw in the data was women were accepting jobs before men were. Okay, so if you looked at the proportion of students who had accepted a job offer over time, like over the course of the senior year and afterwards, at any given point in time, a higher proportion of females had accepted a job offer than men had. That was one fact. The other thing that we saw was, if you look at any given point in time, like people who have accepted a job offer, like let's say 6 months before graduation, certain proportion of men and women have accepted job offers, more women. If you look at the job offers that they have and compute the gender wage gap, there's always a gender wage gap in favor of men, okay? But the gender wage gap is much larger initially in favor of men. Okay, so initially more women have accepted offers, fewer men. But the men who have men who have accepted offers are really, really good offers, basically, right? So
women are accepting the very first offer they get.
I'm going to get there, but basically, So, and then what happens is, over the course of the job search, the gender wage gap actually always stays in favor of men, but it actually gets smaller, because there are a lot more men still looking for jobs later on, and they accept jobs that are not so good, right? And then there are a couple of other things that you see in the data, is that men are much more likely to have rejected a job offer that was actually paying them more than a job offer that they ended up with, right? So there could be many different interpretations of that. One could be that there could be some other aspects of these jobs that they liked, right? And that's why but it could also be that they were being very overconfident, right? So then we saw this in the data, and then we said, okay, this is very interesting. It could be consistent with many things, but one of the things it could be consistent with is, we know that women tend to be more risk averse, right? So in this case, what is the risk? The risk is that, you don't want to end up with a job, you don't want to end up at graduation without a job, right? So what we saw, we collected data on individuals' risk preferences. We also collected data on their overconfidence and their beliefs, right? So, and what we saw is exactly what we had in mind. Our hypothesis was like, women are accepting job offers earlier because they're more risk averse, and men are holding out longer because they're more overconfident. And this is exactly what we found, right?
Notice the complete lack of surprise.
Sure. So, but my point. So now, why is that happening in this case? The issue is that employers make these offers which have exploding deadlines. You're only given 1 week or 2 weeks. So one way, if you wanted to do something about this, is you could universities could tell employers no, you cannot give such. You need to give longer debt, because what happens right now is if a student has a job in hand, they really can't hold on to continue job search, right? Because the likelihood that they'll get another offer and then they'll be able to negotiate it within that 1 or 2 week period is pretty low, right? So, but if on the other hand, let's say they had a month to do all this, then the risk of continuing to search, you still have that job offer in hand. So this has my point is because the labor market has evolved this way, where we have these exploding offers, that tends to have differential impacts by gender.
And it's interesting because it's not just gender. I mean, I'm thinking about international students who are in the US, right? Yeah. They have a serious time limit on how quickly they have to get a job. And so that leads me to my next point, that you've got gender as a key factor that influences this. Then you have socioeconomic background.
Absolutely.
National status, migrant status. There's so many. And the thing is, I feel like we just keep putting people at a disadvantage, and it's just layered.
Absolutely. So going back to the point, think about this example that we were just going through. So now, for whom is the risk of not having a job in hand by the time of graduation higher? For someone who's coming from a low socioeconomic background, right? Someone from a high SES background, they can go stay with their parents, right? They're no hurry finding a job, right? So you're absolutely right that some of these institutional factors, the burden that they impose, tends to. I was focused on gender because I work in settings that are fairly selective, like universities. They usually have 50% men and women, right? So the problem is when you look at socioeconomic diversity in selective colleges, you just don't have enough socioeconomic diversity. So we're now right now doing a project on gaps in higher education by first generation status, whether you have a parent from a college with a college degree or not. So in the US, about 40% of kids who go to college, 4-year college, in the US broadly, they come from a household where neither parent has a college degree. They're first generation kids. But now I'm at the University of Michigan. If you look at the data at the University of Michigan, which is, by the way, a public university, a selective public university, only 12% of kids are coming from first generation families. Only 12%. If you look at the other selective schools, I can tell you it's going to be less than much lower. At the Harvards of the world, it's going to be about 7-8% at most, right? So, and why am I mentioning this? What that means is you can't really do much with the data that you typically have in these selective schools. You can't cut the data by that slice, right? So, going back to international students, you can still do a lot, but when you talk about blacks, for example, or minorities, at Michigan, again, the proportion of black students has been around 6%, right? So it's a joke, right? So that's in Michigan. In all fairness, they've actually done a pretty good job of actually increasing it. It went up from 4 to about 8%, which is a big. Still lower than their share. They double it, but in other schools it's actually been going down because of the Supreme Court ban on affirmative action, and now you know what's happening nationally. So it's only going to get worse, I feel. But my point is you're absolutely right. We were talking about gender, but many of these things that we're talking about are going to have differential impacts, and the burdens are going to be always higher for the more disadvantaged groups.
Basit, it's so, when we think about job applications when you're 21, 22, it just feels like such an early point in your life, right? Exactly. But then we don't realize how long-term those consequences can be. And I think when I was going over your work, your negotiations experiment came up, and which was basically that, and this, I think I should let you speak for it because you obviously know more than I will. But the sense, basically, women tend to not negotiate, and men, even if men aren't negotiating, if they're told that their peers are negotiating, they'll immediately dive into it and they'll do it, right? So it's just, I think, can you talk to me a little bit about just how long-term these consequences are in terms of your overall career success and how your trajectory actually pans out?
I think this is a very important. So part of the reason why in my work I've gone to earlier stages is the nature of human capital investments. Labor market entry is that there's path dependence, right? So choices that you make today are going to have implications for the rest of your life. Like I have right now a 17-year-old who is going through like applying to colleges and so on. And going back to your point, like, when you're 17 or 20, 21, you're not really taking into account the enormity of these decisions and the implications that they're going to have for the rest of your life cycle. But the world that we live in today, like, it's once you are on a path, it becomes very hard to switch, right?
Yeah.
Like, well, for example, when I was in college, I switched from engineering to economics, right? I know that it was the same case for Atif also. He did engineering, and then he moved to economics. Atif Mia I'm talking about. So, but now I think, like, when we look at PhD student applicants that we get, it would be very hard for me to get into econ grad school today, because, like, kids are coming in, they're very, very specialized already. Like I had this session a few weeks ago with students who were doing the high school internship program here. And they seem to, like, really know what they want to do, which is great. But what that means is, if you don't know what you want to do, you're somewhat like the disadvantage you're at is much larger.
Believe me, that's most of us. I still don't know what I want to do.
It always surprises me, how is it that a 16 or 17-year-old know what they want to do. So going back to your point, like, there's tremendous path dependence, right? So we know this from other work, like, there's this very interesting work in the US which shows what are the impacts of graduating during a recession. If you graduate from high school, from college, like, if, let's say, in 2008 when the Great Recession happened, if you happen to be graduating from college then, or, like, we had the COVID shock or something like that, of course, the labor market that year is bad, right? So it's not surprising that your outcomes that year are going to be worse. What is shocking is that these scarring effects are very permanent. So even 10 years out, those cohorts are at a disadvantage. So this is just to tell you, like, that there is a lot of path dependence. The initial choices that you make, they put you on a certain trajectory. And this is why, like, when you think about information frictions and not knowing how to navigate the process, and who's not going to know that? Kids who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. So the cost of making a mistake, I think, in today's world is much, much higher. So I think there's definitely that piece to that. And then now when you think about things like, gender differences in negotiations, right? Because think about, typically when you enter the labor market, you enter the labor market with a certain wage. When you go to the next employer, or your increase next year is going to be some fraction of your current salary, right? So if you didn't negotiate, you left some money on the table, for example, for whatever reason. The next employer they're going to benchmark your salary to what you had at the previous employer. So again, it's not that necessarily that that the market is inherently discriminatory against females or against a given group, but there are these features of the labor market which which then put one group at a disadvantage. And that's why, for example, now in the US, there's this whole different question of, like, what are the implications? There are these salary bans, bans where you can't ask individuals about their
which is so bizarre to me.
Yeah. No, why do you say it's bizarre to you? Like,
because I feel like the more transparency
exactly.
there is,
so I think that's the thing, because there are this parallel where, like, you have these bans. Ban the Box. I don't know if you know the Ban the Box, which was asking people about their if they have a criminal record or not, right? So there was this ban, like, because the idea was that typically minorities tend to have criminal records, right? So and they were losing out, because in the employment application process, if they ask you about you have a criminal record, minorities tend to be more likely to have one. They're going to be at a disadvantage. So a lot of states, especially liberal states, they instituted what they call ban the box, which is you can't ask people about, it used to be in a box, right? So, and what researchers have shown is, when you ban the box, it doesn't do what you think it's going to do. What happens is, now employers get these applications, they don't know whether someone has a criminal record or not, right? They see the name, right? From the name, they can especially if the name, they can tell the race or whatever. If so what researchers have shown that when you take away the box, employers behave as if every black name has a criminal record and every white name has no criminal record. So it actually worsens the gap, because we know we all have prejudices, right? So they've shown this actually worsens the gap. So now, so my point is, again, I do think transparency usually is the best thing, but I think you also have to. So I have a student who's doing this very fascinating work, where there is, especially in the UK, also in the US, depending on the firm size, companies are now required to show the gender gap that they have in the company. Okay, so they have to disclose, like, okay, this is females in our firm make 15% less, for example, or make the same or whatever. And she shows actually, the question that she's interested in is when prospective workers see this information, how does that impact their behavior, right? So if I see a firm which is paying 15% more to men, for example, or 15% less to men, does that make me more or less likely to apply to that firm? And she shows that actually women especially, when they see these gender gaps, and especially gender gaps that are against them, they're less likely to apply to those firms.
And they're missing out on talent then.
So those firms but then in the real world, typically the firms where these gaps are larger also tend to be the one where the salary levels also tend to be higher. Right? So then there's all other implications, right? In terms of sorting of individuals into these firms. And then also she looks at when we have these kinds of transparency laws, but individuals are more or less likely to negotiate with an employer, right? So she shows that actually when a female sees an employer who historically has favored a male, she's less likely to negotiate with that employer.
Wow, I mean, yeah, it makes sense.
It does make sense when you think about it, but then you think like this goes back to the point that we've instituted so many laws, right? Thinking that, okay, these would actually close the gaps without actually thinking through how that would happen, right? So, and so I think there are all these things that one has to think about, like in terms of what implications that is going to have in terms of the worker behavior and so on. And going back to the path dependence that you were mentioning, I think just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I saw this paper by Nina Rossell and Oriana Bandiera, and a third co-author from some university in Lahore, actually. We were talking about the different pressures that men and women face. The pressure that women face in terms of if they don't find a job early enough after graduating, the pressure to get married increases a lot.
Right.
So there are all these interactions that are happening that individuals have to deal with.
I'm going to ask you a very annoying question.
Sure.
How do we fix all of this?
I think one is to be aware of this. So I think the first step I always think about in anything is to be aware of where the problems are, right? So and what the problems are, right? So because if we don't know what the issues are, then we're just sitting in a vacuum and just making policy based on what we feel makes us feel good,
like by the box.
Or makes us feel good, or we think, oh, this would fix something, but we don't know what that something is going to be. So I do think there's a lot more. So the economics of gender. There's a lot of work happening in the US, in different countries, in developing countries. So I think the area is very vibrant, right? So Claudia Golden got the Nobel Prize for this work 2 years ago, I believe, right? So I think there's a lot of work happening. Researchers are doing very interesting work. Also a lot of interventions highlighting what can work and what cannot work. So I think the first step is just being aware of where the issues are. And then secondly, I think how to fix these, I don't think there's always going to be one answer. But I think, and it's also going to be, I think, context dependent. So for example, one thing that I mentioned, if women are less likely to negotiate, right? So we know this. Again, I mentioned Nina's name earlier. She has this very other interesting paper where she showed, so there was a job platform only for programmers, okay? And what she showed over there was typically, and employers could come onto that platform. These are more typically short-term hires, right? You're hiring a programmer for a job or something like that. They could see different people's profiles, and then they could say, oh, they could make a bid on you. Like you could say, okay, do you want to, or you can make a bid, I think, something like that. The worker makes a bid, and the worker makes a bid on the job, and they can accept it or reject it. And what was typically happening is there was a gender gap in the earnings that men and women were getting. Women were making a lower ask, and that was driving the gap, right? So now what did they do on the platform? So initially the ask was you used to put in an ask yourself. What they did is they changed on the platform was they told individuals what is the recommended ask.
Right.
They gave the same recommended ask to men and women. The gender gap went away. Right. So this is an example where you're saying how do we get rid of these things? So on their platform, the problem was easy to, once you identified that the problem was all coming from the fact that men and women were making different asks, then you just suggest the same similar asks to men and women, right? So I have some work where, for example, I'll tell you where we show that, at the end of the semester when you give final grades to students.
Yes.
Sometimes students can ask for a regrade. So we have this paper where we show, because in the data we can see whether there were regrade requests that were made or not. We see that men are more likely to have asked for a regrade request, right? Perhaps this doesn't come as a surprise to you, right?
No, it doesn't.
Right. So, but this has implications, right? So if men are asking for regrades at a higher rate than women, and women also had that option, they didn't. And some of these regrade requests actually result in, instructors also make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So they result in upward improvements in the grade, right? So now if we know that men are more likely to ask, then you can just have a policy that, I am not going to consider any regrade requests. Or if one person makes a regrade request, then everyone's exam is going to be regraded. So, there are these kinds of institutional things that you can do, or like negotiations. Like there are some workplaces which say, there are going to be no negotiations. Or like what we were talking about, if women are less likely to put themselves up for promotion, then you can say, okay, at the end of the year, everyone is going to be considered for the pool, right? So in some cases, we have easier fixes. In other cases,
it's
like
much more deep than
it's
that,
much like when we think about social norms, how do they change? Like I was just reading the other day. So the other big issue that is happening now. In Pakistan, we have the other issue where the fertility rates are very high, but every other country has this problem where fertility is actually getting below replacement. And what is interesting is, especially this is true in the Far East, where the fertility rates are really, really low. And I believe it was Claudia Golden had this figure where if you plot the fertility rates and the gap in household division of work for men and women in countries where the gap is larger, like where women are doing a lot more, these are developed economies, the fertility rate is much lower, right? So there are these interplays, and those things are much, much harder to change, right? Like, how do you change, the expectation of how household production is going to happen and so on.
So, Basit, I'd like to, this might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but considering everything that you know and everything that you've learned, do you think that women or groups that are at a disadvantage, they should work within the system, or should they push back against it? When I say work within the system, I know of so many people who change their names on their applications to sound more white.
I see.
Or not sound like they're from a certain ethnicity.
Sure.
Sort of obfuscate their identity markers that might place them at a disadvantage, or not identify prefer not to say as to what their gender is or whatever, if the sort of forms or whatever allow for that. Do you think that if they can game the system, they're able to overcome some of these hurdles?
That's a hard question too. So I know there is this work of in the early 1900s, like passing white, changing your name so that and there used to be positive returns to that, right? So I think it's very context specific. I feel. I feel it's hard for me to answer, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily acting strategically. Like sometimes, going back to. I'm going to answer your question, but going back to what you were mentioning earlier, right? So one thing in economics is a serious issue with gender, by the way. Females are only 30% of our undergraduate population is females. Econ does worse than the sciences, if you didn't know that, right? So econ is notorious.
Great.
And again, and in economics, there has been a lot of discussion about this for the last couple of decades. Progress is still very slow, but I do think discussion is the first step, right? Being aware that we have a problem is the first step now. But now going back to so now what are the implications of that? Now there is awareness that we have underrepresentation of women at every point, whether it's undergraduate, at faculty levels, and so on. So for example, at faculty, when we have to hire, for example, it's not that because I want to be very careful how I put this. DEI does not mean that you take an unqualified female and hire her instead of a qualified.
Of course.
But this is how a lot of people who are opponents of DEI try to frame things that and we have people at Michigan in other fields who have been going against DEI using this kind of logic. I can tell you, I've been at Michigan, I've been at many other places. It has never been the case that on a recruiting committee, something like that happened.
Yeah.
What is the idea behind DEI? DEI is okay, you take two candidates who are equally qualified, let's say, and one is coming from a disadvantaged background, whether that's gender or socioeconomic background or whatever. That that group is underrepresented in the profession. The point is then, okay, if you can only hire one person, both are equally good, then you go for the person who belongs to the disadvantaged group. That's the point of being aware of these gaps, right? So I think there is that much awareness, for example, in the profession, right? Now, whether these disadvantaged groups could actually benefit from hiding their identity or manipulating certain things, that's very hard for me to say. But for example, historically, I don't know how admissions are going to happen going forward. Historically, like in recent years, if you belong to a disadvantaged background and you were as qualified as, let's say, someone who is from an advantaged background, you would have an advantage, as you should, right?
Yeah, because if you're coming twice as hard.
If you're coming from a disadvantaged background, you're as accomplished as someone who was born with a golden spoon. Then clearly you had to overcome a lot more challenges. Exactly. That shows that you had something more than that other kid had, which made you have similar outcomes, right? So at least in recent years, I think in some of these dimensions, individuals had an advantage. And we also know there is this work which shows that, for example, STEM employers and so on, they have been focused on diversity, and on the margin, like if they're equally qualified male and female, they would want to hire the female, right? Because they know that there's a lack of diversity in their workforce. So there are definitely those things where actually belonging to the disadvantaged group, after you've overcome all those challenges, actually would have helped you.
It's been 20 years. All of these problems have been solved. The gender gap has been overcome.
Okay.
What does the labor market look like?
Okay, so but 20 years is very optimistic.
I can tell you that. As I was saying it, I was like 20 years.
But what I can tell you is, like, what we do know is we had in the last 50 years, there was a change like this that happened, right? Like in the early 50s, female labor supply was really, really, really low, right? So much lower than that of men. And then the 80s, 90s, labor force rates caught up, like pretty close. Now they're very similar. Or like females used to graduate from college at much lower rates. Now they graduate, if anything, the trend has gone the other way around, right? And there are these researchers who have shown that over the last several decades, about more than half of the increase in productivity is attributable to that, right? So my point is that what we do know, like think about it, it's very simple, right? You don't need economists coming to you to tell you that if there's a certain demographic which is missing from our classrooms or from our workplaces, it's the workplace which is at loss, right? Like every group is bringing a certain perspective, right? So if there's a certain demographic that has been shut out from society and doesn't have access to these opportunities, of course that demographic is at a disadvantage. But employers and society is also losing out on that talent, right? So if we were to somehow equalize, get rid of these gaps, I think everyone, it's not only that group would benefit, society as a whole would benefit, because when we think about, there's all this pushback about diversity, equity, inclusion. Why do we care about diversity? It's not something that we like to sing all the time. We care about diversity because you've been in many workplaces. We all benefit from a more diverse classroom. Like if we have students coming from different backgrounds, everyone has a different perspective. And we don't have to agree with every perspective, but if we can hear as many perspectives in our classroom or in workplaces, the discussion is richer, the workplace is going to be richer, the dynamics, the productivity is going to be better. So I think diversity is good, not only for the sake of it, but actually for economic reasons.
Yeah, that's how you break these cycles of privilege, and that's how, if you can get everybody in the same room, that's, I think, where the...
But getting them to the same room is the challenge, right? Like I think, because this goes back to the point, we were talking about college, but these inequalities are baked in even at earlier stages, right? So we were talking about gender, but like when you think about socioeconomic diversity, right? What kind of school you go to, especially where you live, and I feel like in the US, you used to have this intergenerational mobility much higher, but I feel even that's getting worse. The zip code that you live into now, or the family that you live into, because the college that you're going to now, those decisions are being which kindergarten you're going to go to and which primary school you're going to go to is now going to determine which college you're going to end up in. it's the same thing as used to happen in Pakistan. Because
Yeah.
I grew up here, and I feel Pakistani society is very much like that, right? Where
100%.
there is no intergenerational mobility. Like people are stuck in this. It's pretty depressing actually here, right? So people are stuck in
many
those cycles
reasons.
for many reasons. But it's actually very like you can see it, right? You can interact with these because here you interact with people from different segments of society, right? Like you have people, you have domestic help, right? They have kids, right? And you look at them and it's like, it's awful, right? Like, no matter how much you help them, they're going to be stuck in that cycle.
Yeah.
So, and the US unfortunately is also moving in that direction where like the equality of opportunity, there never was an equality of opportunity. Even pre-Trump, I feel the equality of opportunity was getting worse and worse.
I think that for me, when I consider, what is it? Why don't we have upward mobility or economic mobility or whatever? We're only just scratching the surface when we sort of perceive, okay, but I think that over here, like just last month when Asim and Maroof were having this conversation, they thought of education as the way that they can actually pull themselves out from these intergenerations to actually move, have that economic mobility within generations. Do you agree?
I think yes, but I do think.
I think you know too much.
No, I don't. No. I think education. Without education, there's no hope. But is that sufficient? Like because in Pakistan we have these parallel systems, right? Like if you don't go to you didn't like you know what I'm like. There are these universities you can get degrees from which are not worth anything.
Yeah.
Right. So. And unfortunately, like even, and having said this, like there are positive examples also. Like I was talking with people at LUMS, and they have this NOP program, right, which has been very successful. A national outreach program. It's very costly, but it's been very successful in the sense that they have had many graduates from it. Now they're trying to they want to do an evaluation of the program, right? Because if they're spending so much money, one should want to know, like how effective has it been. But I do think without education, there's no hope whatsoever, right? But I do worry that there is so much segmentation out there in the market that there's so many so many universities out there where some of them are totally worthless. And I do worry that, like, in the US, we say, I personally believe, yes, everyone should invest in human capital. But sometimes I wonder, are there returns to human capital or certain kinds of human capital in Pakistan?
That's interesting. I'm trying to suppress the rage that I'm feeling, and just in terms of how insidious all of it really is, and how we place ourselves at so much of a disadvantage just because of the information that we're getting all the time.
So what I would say is if we don't live in a just world, right? Like no one, right? So but
no.
But my point is, I think it's like this. I'm going to say something because I want to end on a positive note, and I think I'm going to say something which I tell my students, my PhD students all the time, is you should worry about things that are in your control, and there's not much point. It's hard not to worry about things that are happening otherwise. But you're not going to get much out of worrying about things that are not in your control, right? So what is in your control? What is in your control is going out, getting the right kind of human capital, making the right investments. Like if you get at a workplace, putting in, giving your 110%, doing whatever you can do. Now, if there's again, because I want to be clear, not every workplace is discriminatory, right? So, and if there's a certain workplace which is going to be discriminatory, you can always move to the next place, right? So, the point that my advice would be focus on things that are in your control, and try to push back, through your work. Right,
let your work speak.
Let your work speak for yourself, and I do believe it's not going to be a quick.
Not 20 years.
No, that I don't know. But even at the individual level, I don't there are going to be setbacks, but you have to persevere, right? I do believe that if you persevere, you keep giving in your 100%. Eventually, the world will recognize your talent. I do believe in that.
That's good to hear. Thank you so much, Basit.
Thank you for
being with us, and we really hope that that knowledge of all of these ways that we put ourselves at a disadvantage helps us to overcome these challenges.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.